In the village of Burwell, Cambridgeshire, a barn quickly fills with people gathering to watch a Punch and Judy show. There are children sitting at the front, legs folded beneath them, adults packed tightly in behind, and outside more people still trying to get in, pressing at the doors, unwilling to miss what promises to be an evening of rare entertainment. Inside, the air is warm, crowded, alive with anticipation. Less than an hour later, many of them will be dead. The building will be engulfed in flames, and when they try to escape, when instinct drives them towards the only way out, they will find that the door they entered through will not open. Because at some point before the show began, someone had nailed it shut. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to understand the world they were living in. England in 1727 was not yet industrial, not yet modern, and certainly not safe. Most people lived close to the land, rising with the light, working long hours, and measuring time not by clocks but by seasons and survival. Houses were small, often shared with extended family, and built from timber, thatch, and wattle, materials that made life possible but also dangerously flammable. There was no electricity, no regulated lighting, only candles and oil lamps that flickered and smoked, and, if mishandled, destroyed everything. Entertainment was rare, for children especially, whose lives were typically filled with chores, discipline, and early responsibility. Moments of play were precious, and that is where the puppets came in. Punch and Judy shows, already well established by the early 1700s, were a peculiar mix of comedy and chaos. Originating from Italian street theatre, the character of Punch had evolved into a gleefully anarchic figure, a hunchback with a hooked nose and a voice that squeaked through a special reed. But he wasn't a gentle character. He lied, he cheated, and he fought. He struck out at anyone who crossed him. His wife Judy, the policeman, even the devil. And yet he always came out on top, always escaped consequences, always returned to that same crooked grin. There is something dark in that, something unsettling if you stop to think about it, and yet that darkness is part of the appeal. Children loved it, not despite the chaos, but because of it. In a world where they were expected to obey, to be quiet, to know their place, Punch broke every rule. He shouted, he was naughty, he laughed in the face of authority. And he did it all with a rhythm and energy that was impossible to ignore. The puppeteer's voice, the slap of the stick, the reactions of the crowd. It was immersive, immediate, and alive. For adults too, there was something appealing in the mischief. It was satire wrapped in silliness, a safe way to laugh at power and order without consequence. And so, when a travelling puppet show arrived in Burwell as part of a local fair, it drew a crowd. The fair itself was likely tied to the rhythms of rural life, perhaps a harvest gathering or a hiring fair where labourers sought work for the coming year. These events were social anchors, bringing together people from surrounding areas for trade, food, drink and spectacle. Stalls would have lined the open spaces, selling simple goods, while ale flowed and conversations stretched into the evening. But the real draw, especially for the children, was the puppet show. The man behind it is most often named as Robert Shepherd, a travelling showman who, like many others at the time, moved from village to village with his family and a small troupe, setting up wherever there was space and, more importantly, an audience willing to gather. These shows were not grand productions. There were no theatres, no permanent stages, no guarantees of success. Everything depended on the crowd that turned up that evening, on whether enough people were willing to part with a coin, and on whether the performance could hold their attention once it began. It's widely believed that Shepherd charged a penny for entry, a small amount, but enough to make the night feel like something worth paying for. Burwell would have seemed like an ideal stop, a rural village, the kind of place where entertainment did not come often, and where word of something new would spread quickly. All Shepherd needed was a space, and so he rented a barn, a structure never designed for entertaining. It was a working building, practical, functional, built to store hay and shelter animals, not to contain a crowd of people packed tightly together. But it was available, it was large enough at first glance, and for a travelling show that was often enough. As evening fell, people began to arrive, and then more followed. and then more again. As word spread, the crowd thickened, people pushing inside, eager not to miss the performance, until the space filled quickly, bodies pressed tightly together, the air growing warm and heavy with anticipation. And still they came. The barn was packed to the rafters with spectators, and still there was a queue outside, unwilling to leave. Among those waiting was a man named Richard Whittaker. He worked for the farmer who owned the barn, charged with the care of the horses stabled inside, and he believed that this alone should have been enough to grant him free entry. Robert Shepherd disagreed and started the show without him. At some point, those managing the event made a decision that would later haunt the memory of the village. Fearing that the crush of people trying to force their way in would cause chaos, they nailed the barn doors shut. It was perhaps an attempt at control, a way to keep order in an already overcrowded space. But in doing so, they turned the barn into a trap. Richard Whittaker was determined that he was going to see the show. Being turned away had only hardened that resolve, and rather than leave, he chose another way in. To bypass payment, he made his way into the hayloft above the stables, climbing up in the dark and moving carefully over the partition that separated the horses below from the crowded barn beyond. With him he carried a lantern, a short candle burning inside it, his only light as he made his way forward. From below he could hear Punch's voice ringing out, sharp and unmistakable, the children laughing and shouting back, completely absorbed in the chaos of it. Whittaker paused for a moment, listening, aware that the show had already begun without him, and then, not wanting to miss more of it, he began to hurry. In the darkness of the loft he misjudged his footing and tripped on an old chain, and in that instant he stumbled, the lantern slipping from his grasp and falling into the stall below. The barn was constructed from huge oak beams, its outer walls covered in wooden boards painted with tar to keep out the weather, and above it a roof of dry straw thatch. The summer had been long and dry, and the barn itself was already old. Inside, everything was dry as a bone, filled with hay and dusty cobwebs. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and at around 9 p.m. that evening, it found one. The candle tumbled from the lantern into the hay. At first there may have been confusion rather than panic, a flicker, a smell of smoke, a moment of hesitation as people tried to understand what they were seeing. But then the reality would have hit all at once. Within seconds it spread with a speed that felt almost unreal, racing across the timbers, into the roof, through the dry materials above their heads, until what had been a contained space became something else entirely. The sound came first, a low roar that built and built, followed by the sharp cracking of wood as it began to fail. Then came the heat, sudden and overwhelming, and then the smoke, thick and choking, filling the space, stealing the air from their lungs, until that confusion gave way to something sharper, something immediate: fear. Richard Whittaker looked on in horror, but made no attempt to help. He simply fled the way he had come. The crowd surged towards the exits. The crush of bodies, the rising heat, the smoke thickening, children separated from parents, voices shouting, crying, pleading. The same closeness that had made the show feel exciting now became suffocating and inescapable. Hands struck the wood, shoulders drove into it, voices rising from urgency into panic. Those at the front pressed hard against the door, unable to force it open, unable to move back, caught between the barrier and the weight of everyone behind them. The pressure built quickly, bodies pushing forward, not out of cruelty, but out of the need to escape. Children were caught in that movement, too small to resist it, too surrounded to find space, lifted, pushed, or pulled under, struggling to breathe as the air thickened around them. Above, the fire intensified. Burning fragments began to fall, catching on clothing, on skin, while the smoke grew heavier, turning each breath into something painful, something insufficient. The sound became overwhelming, the roar of the fire, the splintering of wood, the shouting and screaming merging into something constant and indistinct. Later, an article in the local paper described the event. When the roof fell, which was scarcely half an hour from the commencement of the fire, the shrieks and anguish of the helpless sufferers were momentarily ended in universal silence. In death, the bodies were reduced to a mass of mangled carcasses, half consumed and wholly undistinguishable. Somewhere in that chaos, the door finally broke. Outside, the fire did not remain contained. It spread beyond the barn, catching on nearby buildings and pulling others into the disaster until the scale of it reached into the village itself. Several outhouses and homes were consumed by the flames, and it's reported that an elderly woman and child who had not even attended the performance lost their lives as the fire took hold. And when it was over, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. Bodies burned beyond recognition, families searching through what remained, trying to identify loved ones from fragments, from anything that might still be known. 78 people lost their lives that night, 51 children and 27 adults, drawn there by the promise of laughter and colour, by the strange, irresistible world of Punch and Judy, by a brief escape from their harsh world. Among the dead were the puppet show organiser Robert Shepherd and his family. The victims of the fire were buried in a mass grave marked with a distinctive white headstone. The villagers had questions. Some believed it was nothing more than a terrible accident, the inevitable result of flame and overcrowding and a door secured in a way that could not be undone in time. Others looked for something more, and one name continued to surface in those accounts: Richard Whittaker. He was arrested and held at Cambridge Castle until his trial at Cambridge Assizes on the 27th of March 1728. One witness, the son of a farmer Richard worked for, claimed he had been with him in the hayloft. He reported that Richard had been beating the lantern about after being refused entry to the show. Despite this testimony, Whittaker was acquitted. It was decided that the incident was nothing more than a tragic accident. It would not be until 47 years later that the story would take a darker turn. A newspaper report in the Ipswich Journal, dated the 19th of February 1774, described a deathbed confession. It told of an old man in a nearby village close to Newmarket, who shortly before his death claimed he had a burden to reveal. He confessed that he had set fire to the barn at Burwell on the 8th of September 1727 after being denied entry to a puppet show, an act he said had led to such dreadful consequences. No name was given in the report, but many believed it could only have been Richard Whittaker, a man who, it was said, had carried the weight of that night with him for the rest of his life. In the aftermath, Burwell was changed forever. Families grieved, and a community struggled to make sense of a tragedy that had unfolded in minutes. The barn that had held so much excitement became a place of memory and loss. And there is something haunting in the contrast. A puppet show, meant to entertain and bring people together, became the setting for one of the deadliest fires of its time. The very things that made it joyful, the crowd, the closeness, the shared experience, also made it dangerous. And yet it is not just a story about fire. It is a story about people, about a community seeking joy in a difficult world, about children drawn to laughter, and about the consequences of decisions made in a moment. Because most evenings end the way they are meant to, but sometimes they do not. It seems to me that this tragedy was brought about by a couple of very bad decisions, nailing the only exits shut, even with good intentions to stop more people going in, and certainly Richard Whittaker, a man who was aggrieved that he'd not been allowed entry, and it led to all of those deaths. Now, despite the tragic nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.